Okay. Hello, everybody, and welcome to SOAR's fifth Psych Talk of the semester. Thank you all for coming today, and thank you, Dr. Burciaga, for joining us today. We are excited to hear about your research. Today's Psych Talk is sponsored by an ODEI grant awarded to Dr. Brandilyn Villarreal and Maria Inturbide. A little bit about Dr. Edelina Burciaga. Dr. Burciaga is an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Colorado, Denver, and a faculty affiliate in the Immigration and Citizenship Law program at CU Boulder Law and the CU Population Center. Dr. Burciaga received her Ph.D. in sociology at the University of California, Irvine in 2016, a JD from Boston University School of Law in 2005, and both MA and BA from the Stanford University in the 2000s. Her research examines the experiences of undocumented immigrants who came to the United States as children and who remained in the country without a pathway to citizenship. Her research specifically examines how state and local laws and policies shape the transition to adulthood for this group. She has conducted research in California, Georgia, and Colorado. Findings from this research has been published in Mobilization, Ethnicities, Law and Policy, Law and Social Inquiry, and the Association of Mexican American Educators Journal. Please help me welcome Dr. Burciaga. Oh, I don't think I made you. Okay, you should have the ability to present now.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you. I'm gonna share my screen because I have a presentation and I'm gonna hope that it actually, let me try this because this happened at the, and then I know that I haven't gone into presentation mode yet, but okay. So now, do you see my notes or do you see the slide?
Notes.
Okay. This is what happened last time. I'm like terrible at sharing. But here, this is it. I don't know why I should, okay. Now does it look right? Okay. Y'all can see how much I prepare for talks. Dr. Villarreal and I did a program together at UC Irvine, the Pedagogical Fellows Program. And it's in that program that I really honed this I don't know, practice of writing out my talks in the PowerPoint slide. So just in case I forget anything. But thank you, Edgar, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you for inviting me here today. I'm excited tonight to talk about some research that I'd been doing when I first moved to Colorado. So I've been at the University of Colorado, Denver since 2016. And when I came to Denver in 2016, it coincided with a change in presidential administration, and I think a really important time in our country's history, right? And thinking about some of the issues that were on the forefront that I think continue to remain important. But this, the start of my tenure track position coincided with the election of Donald Trump as president of the United States of America. And so this project really falls within the historical context of that experience. What you can see here on the screen are sort of two different images of Colorado. So the more urban image is actually an image of Denver and the downtown Denver skyline with the Rocky Mountains in the back. And the other image is an image of the San Luis Valley, which is actually in southern Colorado. In the San Luis Valley, it's a very kind of rural community. Actually, one of the things that they're known for is growing mushrooms. So there's mushroom grow houses out there. And this project, I started in 2016, the Colorado DACA project. And the purpose of the project really was to get a sense of the experiences of undocumented young adults that were living across the state of Colorado. So a lot of the research here in Colorado tends to focus on immigrant folks living in the Denver metro area because it is one of the most populous areas, but Colorado is a really unique sort of space in the sense that we have rural agricultural communities in the state, like in the San Luis Valley. And then, of course, you might be familiar with our ski towns and ski areas. So we have many resort communities across the state of Colorado, places where people come to ski and do sports in the summer. And the economies of those communities and the workforce in the communities do tend to be immigrants, Latino immigrants in particular. So the Colorado DACA project started really got started in earnest mid-2016, and it's a survey and interview-based study. And so I'll be talking about the findings of that research project tonight. But as Edgar mentioned, I've done research across 3 locations: Colorado, the Los Angeles, California region, and Atlanta, Georgia. And I've been doing this research for about 10 years now. And so some of what you'll hear tonight is informed by that previous research with a focus on Colorado. And so the launch of the study, as I mentioned, coincided with the announcement in September 2017 of the proposed wind down of the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program. And I'll unpack some of these terms throughout the course of the talk. And the paper that this talk is based on focuses on the impact of that announcement and how undocumented young people were making sense of this decision, and the ways in which the proposed end of the DACA program was playing out for undocumented young folks can really be seen in the following quote. So Emilio, who we interviewed in 2017, shared with us that the DACA program is like, he says, we have this saying that we are in a golden cell, la jaula de oro. It's like we are trapped, but at least the cage is gold. It feels nice being here, and I love it, but there's also that feeling where you feel a little trapped because you can't leave. It might be a false sense of security because they could take DACA away whenever, and then you don't know where you stand. So it is kind of scary jumping into something like graduate school and not knowing where I'm going to be in my status halfway through my studies. So that's a little bit limiting because you can only make 2-year plans, and that's probably the biggest limits, not being able to travel and not being able to make long-term plans. So in the remainder of the talk, I'm going to unpack why and how the DACA program really was both a blessing for a lot of the undocumented immigrant young adults we got to know through this study, but also, as he describes, kind of a golden cage or a golden cell. So in the field of sociology, we talk about immigrant generations, and the young people that I talk to, the young adults that I talk to, are known as the undocumented 1.5 generation. And this designation signals their place between the first generation. So these are typically immigrants that came as adults and who come to the United States primarily to work. And the second generation, these are children of first generation immigrants who were born in the United States, so they have citizenship. There are approximately 11 million undocumented immigrants currently living in the United States, and that number has fluctuated between 10 and 12 million, and it stayed pretty steady. It might be down to 10 million currently, but it stays pretty steadily in that 10 to 12 million range. And so 1/5 of these 11 million undocumented immigrants are a part of the 1.5 generation. And how we've come to kind of label this group is that they migrated to the United States before the age of 16. Many came even before they were 12 years old. And I can share from the 10 years that I've been doing this research that many of these young people came and they don't even remember making the trip. So they came, before before the age of 3 or 4. Some even came at 6 months old. And they're under the age of 35. So these really are undocumented immigrants who have lived and grown up in the United States, have been to the public schools, and have really been sort of socialized in this sort of American context. The vast majority of the undocumented 1.5 generation are of Latino origin, 59% from Mexico, 11% from Central America, and 7% from South America. But the remaining 23% come from a variety of countries, including Jamaica, Brazil, South Korea, and even the UK. So it's a much more it's often a much more diverse population than is often presented or painted, particularly in the media. I think one important thing to understand about undocumented immigrant status is that it's not visible or fixed, right? So you can't look at a person and necessarily know their immigration status at all. Although, I think there are, there is a kind of association of undocumented immigrant status with being brown, and that can lead to racial profiling, but it's not a status that you can really look at a person and say, hey, I know this person's immigration status. For the undocumented young people that I've gotten to know, their immigration status becomes really important to their own personal kind of social mobility or trajectory through life after high school, and I'll explain kind of why that is. It can shape one's aspirations for their future because there are various kind of legally constructed barriers and challenges that present themselves when one is an undocumented immigrant in the United States, and it can have significant social consequences. So my work really looks at the transition to and through adulthood that undocumented young folks experience in two main areas: in their educational experiences. So are they going to college? How are they making it through college? How do they pay for college? What do they do after college? And sort of in their social experiences. Do they feel like they belong, that they're a part of their communities? When they're in college, what kind of social groups do they connect to? And what are the social supports that they experience when they're kind of transitioning to and through adulthood? Adding, I think, another important layer to the experiences of undocumented young adults is that there are various kind of levels of law that influence their trajectory to and through adulthood. So the reason why the post-high school experience is so important in the lives of undocumented young people is that access to public education is only guaranteed by law through elementary school, through high school. So there was a very important case, the Plyler v. Doe case, which made its way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court of the United States held that undocumented immigrant children and the children of undocumented immigrants couldn't be charged to attend public schools. This was actually something that was happening in a Texas school district in the 1970s. The school district was wanting to charge undocumented immigrant children to attend their public schools. And the case made its way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said basically that the U.S. had a vested interest in ensuring the education of all children that are in the United States, regardless of their immigration status. The Supreme Court didn't go so far as to say that undocumented immigrants have a right to a higher education, to a college education. And so that's resulted in a shifting in sort of various laws in different states. So in California, where Cal Poly Humboldt is, it's one of the most welcoming states for undocumented immigrant students in terms of college access. So there's both the ability to pay in-state tuition if you're eligible, and access to state and often institutional financial aid. In Georgia, the other state, or another state where my research is situated, Georgia is one of these states that actively bans undocumented immigrant students from attending the top 3 public colleges and universities in the state. And undocumented immigrants have to pay out-of-state tuition at any of the public colleges or universities in the state. So that can amount to as much as 3 times as much. Just a kind of an aside, and to make, kind of share a further example, the undocumented young people that I interviewed in Georgia, many of them weren't enrolled in even community college. And I asked, why aren't you enrolled in community college? That can be a pathway to college. And they told me that, for 1 year of community college as an in-state resident, it's $7,000. But for an out-of-state resident, 1 year of community college is $21,000. So it's a lot more expensive to attend colleges in states where there's no in-state tuition available. California is not like that at all. Key kind of legal contexts that have emerged. The last major comprehensive immigration reform was in 1986, IRCA. Since then, there hasn't been any kind of federal level move to regularize the status of undocumented immigrants living in the United States. And then the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program was introduced in 2012, and I'll talk specifically about the benefits and drawbacks of that program. But each state is so different at a certain point. So college access laws vary. There's statewide restrictive laws that look different in different states. Driver's licenses are another important thing that can help undocumented immigrants navigate day-to-day life. And then even at the local sort of city level, you have some cities that have become sanctuary cities. These are cities that look to kind of integrate and welcome undocumented immigrants. And then you have cities that are also known as rule of law cities. And in these cities, enforcement through local police, there might be more cooperation between local police and immigration and customs enforcement, or ICE. So there's really a varied political context for undocumented immigrants living in the United States, and that's really sort of the core of what my own research looks at, is what do these different political contexts mean for the undocumented young adults living in these places. So in 2012, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program was introduced by then President Barack Obama through an executive order. So it's not a law, it's not a policy. It was a very sort of technical kind of maneuver that the administration did at the time as a result really of years of mobilization by undocumented immigrant youth activists. They pushed and pushed and pushed for the development, relief, and education for alien minors, or DREAM Act, which has never been passed. And the DACA program emerged from that advocacy and mobilization with the hope that there would be some kind of legislative solution introduced either through at some point in Barack Obama's presidency, or in the hopes that after Barack Obama would be another president that was more immigrant friendly. Instead, we got a way less immigrant, I would say an immigrant hostile administration was ushered in 2016. And Donald Trump really ran on an anti-immigrant platform and enacted a lot of also through executive action, a lot of followed through on many of the promises that he had made during the presidential election when he was on the campaign trail. And one of these promises that he made was to end the DACA program. And so in 2017, then President Donald Trump, through his Attorney General Jeff Sessions, announced the wind down of the DACA program. And what that meant is that folks that had DACA, when it expired, it would just sort of the administration would let it run out. There would be no renewals and no new applications accepted. So the Supreme Court heard the DACA case is one of these cases that made it to the Supreme Court. It was heard in November 2019, and a decision was issued in July 2020. And I'll just give you a spoiler alert. I'll revisit this at the end, but spoiler alert, the program still exists, right? So, and I'm happy to answer questions about kind of the logic behind why the program was allowed to continue. But as I mentioned, all of this kind of socio-political historical stuff was happening right as I was starting on the tenure track and had moved to Colorado and wanted to start the Colorado DACA project, which is eventually what the research project came to be known as. And I wanted to start the project to understand really the role of sort of very local contexts in the kind of labor market, so career trajectories and educational trajectories of undocumented young adults. And as I spent some time describing at the beginning, Colorado is super interesting because there's these sort of local micro contexts that exist in the state that I think are pretty unique to Colorado as a place, right? We have mountain resort communities, we have urban, suburban communities, and we have rural agricultural communities. And so there has been a trend in the sociological research about undocumented young adults to explore the experiences of young people sort of growing up outside of these traditional immigrant gateways, places like California, Texas, and New York. And so this project contributes to that body of research, and also I think, contributes to kind of understanding the differential effects of undocumented status and DACA by what we call place, right? Like where you grow up. And I'm sure you all as individuals can kind of think about the ways in which the place that you grew up shaped who you are, right? And how now the place that you're at, how that's also shaping who you are. So that's a core question that I ask in my own research, is sort of how does place shape who we are, and how do we shape the places that we're, a part of? So let me see. Here we are. Okay, is that right? Yeah. Okay, so the questions guiding the project were, how were DACA recipients in Colorado experiencing the precarity of the program or the uncertainty associated with the DACA program, both before and after the Trump administration announced the termination of the program? And how are they making sense of navigating daily life despite the uncertainty of the DACA program? And so as I noted, Colorado is, I think, notable not only for its kind of geographic kind of characteristics, but also political characteristics. So it used to be a very anti-immigrant state back in the early 90s. And we saw a shift over time. It became what we call a re-emergent immigrant destination. There's a very rich and deep history in Colorado and in Denver of Chicanos and Latinos. Denver is one of the sites for the key site for the emergence of the Chicano movement of the 70s. Again, because of the rural agricultural context, the kind of hospitality industries, Latinos are a really important part of this state's history, present and future. And so we've seen some important shifts in immigration policy in the state. We do have in-state residency tuition, a law very similar to the AB 540 law in California. We do have driver's licenses, although these driver's licenses are marked. And you can see that there are significant portions of the state that voted for Donald Trump in 2016, and then other portions of the state that voted for the Democratic candidate Hillary Clinton in 2016. So it's a place that's referred to as purplish, because if you mix this red and blue, you get purple. So it's a pretty mixed socio-political context. The data for this paper comes from a survey. One version of the survey was piloted in 2016. We did a follow-up survey 2017 through 2018, and then also interviews with young people in the Denver area and young people in Grand Junction, which is a more rural western part of the state. And we only had one respondent who kind of grew up in the mountain resort communities. So the project, I think if we pick it up again, we really want to focus energies and efforts in those other areas. But we also attended community-based events and did informational interviews with community stakeholders. And so you can see some of the kind of places where we did some research, either got a lot of surveys from or were able to do interviews, but Boulder, Denver, Grand Junction, Alamosa, Greeley. And so as you move out from the Denver area, it gets more rural, agricultural. Breckenridge, Vail, these are all ski resort towns. So this paper builds on the notion of liminal legality, and this is an idea that was introduced by Cecilia Menjivar in 2006. And basically what's, I think, important to understand about liminal legality for the purposes of this paper is that in the absence of any kind of comprehensive immigration reform, now for almost 40 years, we've seen a real growth in temporary statuses. And these temporary statuses include immigration statuses like DACA or temporary protected status. And what's really notable about these statuses is that they don't provide any pathway to citizenship. And yet people are living in the country with these statuses for years. Cecilia Menjivar wrote about people from El Salvador and Honduras in the starting her research in the late 1980s, early 1990s, I think. And so people who've been living with a temporary status for 20, 30, 35, 40 years. And so it really creates this sense of permanent temporariness. And it's really these types of statuses that have grown the most. And so, I think we've seen an influx of people from, we've seen some sort of recent events that are leading to more groups of kind of temporary immigrants, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, the war in Ukraine. So we're kind of, continuing to see a growth in these temporary statuses. And so this paper looks at how the specific political moment and the announced termination of the DACA program, how does that kind of amplify this liminal or temporary experience? How does historical moment shape that experience of liminality for our participants? So this is just a general portrait of the DACA population. And as I said, the vast majority of DACA recipients are from Mexico, followed by El Salvador and Guatemala. But we see, a greater variety, Brazil, South Korea, Jamaica, the Philippines. So there is some, representational diversity in amongst the DACA population. And there's about 14,000 DACA recipients in the state of Colorado. So this is just, it kind of shows you some of the characteristics of the respondents that we were surveying. So the sample size in 2016 was relatively small. The sample size in the 2018 survey was bigger, but you can see that the current age, these are young people. So they're 23, 22. As I shared at the beginning, the average age at arrival is between 5 and 6 years old. So quite young. They entered school here. In both surveys, the vast majority are female. In Colorado, I think unsurprisingly, the vast majority of kind of country of origin or country of birth is Mexico. And so, a lot of our recipients in both in 2016 and 2018 were employed, and also in the 2018 survey, a much higher percentage were enrolled in college. And we did see some increase in numbers of folks attending college between once DACA was introduced. Let's see. Okay, so you can see that there are national and our local surveys. And the national surveys, our numbers add up in a lot of ways, or match the national surveys in a lot of ways. But many of the DACA recipients that we surveyed got their first job, they got a better job, they were able to get a driver's license. That's not necessarily because of DACA, but friendly policies, opened a first bank account, got my first credit card. So you can see how life got qualitatively better for DACA recipients, both nationally and in Colorado. And I want to establish this because I think it really underscores the uncertainty that the announced end of the DACA program introduced into these young people's lives. So because the DACA program was always designed as a sort of 2-year program, and with DACA, I should say that with DACA, you get a work permit. So the work permit looks a lot like a Social Security card, and you can use that document to get a job. It can be accepted for other things, to open a bank account. You also get a 2-year temporary stay of deportation. So if you're driving and you get pulled over, you can't, getting pulled over can't lead to deportation because you have DACA. And this is actually something that happens to a lot of undocumented immigrants who are not protected by DACA. And so DACA recipients, I think, have always understood that DACA is a temporary status, as Vanessa notes here. And some of the things that they've had to navigate is that, being able to, if their expiration for the work permit is approaching, making sure they apply in time so that there's no lapse in their work permit. And sometimes having to explain to employers what this 2-year work permit means. And so recipients expressed in surveys and in interviews sort of the fundamental temporariness and uncertainty of the DACA program because of its 2-year length. And so recipients described kind of having a hard time getting things like home loans or car loans because, if you want to get a home loan, that's, the typical home loan can be 15 to 30 years. And so I think that, a lot of recipients described kind of how it's a process of having to explain to people what the status means, and sort of hesitance on the part of financial institutions to lend them money because they see it as a temporary residency. And so, Bertha describes, I guess we're still seen as illegal immigrants and we still don't get all the benefits of being a resident. DACA has opened many opportunities for me. I'm very grateful, but I hope that one day we can have the opportunity to become U.S. permanent residents and U.S. citizens. So most recipients were aware of DACA's limitations, but even with the sort of those sort of minimal gains were very, very meaningful to them. When we started engaging in data collection, as I said, it coincided with the announced termination of the program. And we actually took a pause, and rather than talk to people, because I felt like this was a very emotional and traumatic time for folks. And I didn't want to be this researcher that's like, hey, tell me how you're doing, right? Like with this very traumatic thing. Instead, we decided to talk to stakeholders, folks that have been working with undocumented immigrant youth in the state. And they shared that they had seen a significant rise, not just because of the announced termination of the DACA program, but the whole presidential campaign had taken its toll. The rhetoric of the Trump administration in particular had led to increased depression and mental health issues. And so in these legal services offices that typically would be providing legal advice had brought in a mental health counselor to come to the legal services office once a week to meet with folks. And they said they needed a second counselor to be coming because people were really experiencing emotional trauma and anxiety, all related to the rise in anti-immigrant rhetoric and sentiment under the new administration. And so, folks reflected on how the election of Donald Trump had emboldened anti-immigrant sentiment. So people feeling more comfortable saying, build the wall, or wearing, the signature Make America Great Again caps. One of the people we interviewed worked at a university, and she said she remembers one of her students wearing that cap. And we just sort of saw an increase in an amplification of this kind of uncertainty around the DACA status. And so as I shared, in the survey, folks really did experience significant benefits from the DACA program. And these benefits were really educational, economic, and emotional, right, or well-being. So people described these things that they had dreamed about doing when they were young, as Clarissa says, getting my license, being able to buy things with my own credit, normal stuff that people do. And she says, I'm more confident. So DACA allowed her to do these things. And she said, I can do stuff by myself instead of depending on others. So that was one of the, most important benefits of the DACA program for her. And so as individuals reflected on what it would mean to lose DACA, Valeria shares, I definitely wouldn't be able to work, at least not where I work now. And so one survey participant, we had a sort of open-ended question, is there anything else that's important for us to know? And this person's, offered, I was able to have goals in education, to think about having a professional career. And so, I now have an exceptional career that far exceeds what anyone had envisioned for me. So kind of just demonstrating the challenges that an undocumented status can present when someone is looking to have, higher career aspirations and goals. Survey participants described, losing their sense of self, right? I would lose my ability to be proud of my status and my story goes away. And also a very realistic concern because I am no longer safe from deportation. And also kind of demonstrating this sense that I will lose confidence in this country. So this participant, I think felt like the DACA status, it was an affirmation of their own sense of belonging here, and to take that away would really, they would lose confidence in the US. This participant describes being in Colorado since they were 8 months old, and they would have to totally, re-envision their goals and aspirations if they no longer had DACA. So participants described what we termed the affective consequences of the potential end of the program, which was feeling on edge all the time. Participants described feeling scared, worried, anxious. And so you can see that there were real kind of emotional consequences of the announced termination of the program. And they were tied to educational and economic security in a lot of ways, but also, those things had given them a sense of self. Joanna described how, losing DACA would be a heartbreak for her whole family. And a lot of participants shared that with DACA, they were able to get better jobs with more security, stability, and that they in turn were helping their families pay bills. And this was something that happened even before DACA, but I think that with the higher paying jobs and better jobs with better benefits, there was just more security shared in the whole family. And so, losing DACA wouldn't have just meant individual losses for DACA recipients, but it would have ripple effects for their family. And so David, who was kind of an outlier in our study, he wasn't enrolled in college. He was sort of working as an independent consultant and not necessarily reliant on his DACA status for financial security. And so he said, I remember he said in our interview, he's like, I don't feel as anxious or nervous because I'm not in school. I do not depend on DACA for a work permit. But he was, reflective enough to say, but come back to me in a year or two when DACA is closer to expiring to see if he felt differently. So, he said, he said it sort of jokingly, right? And I think that this was one way that he was coping with the potential loss of DACA. And I highlight these particular experiences because in the course of the study and in our interviews, it wasn't unusual for participants to be very optimistic and hopeful, and also very pessimistic and uncertain and anxious. And so one survey participant says, DACA has opened so many doors for me, but I do not define all my successes or my identity around DACA. It is a paper, but it's also not the end of my world if they take it away, because I've seen my parents get ahead without it. So participants talked about their undocumented parents who have built, lives for themselves and their siblings without papers. And so they could point to folks who've been able to build a life in the United States, but at the same time, and in this way, they could challenge, I think, some of the narratives about undocumented immigrants, and also assert their own agency. So again, sort of coping mechanisms included kind of trying to do everything that you can while you have DACA, but to also not let DACA define you. I think that was really important. As Emilio, who we met at the beginning, says, I just try to put myself in the best position possible for anything that happens. So, participants were really trying in the day-to-day to take as much control of their present and future as they could. So in 2020, the Supreme Court held that the DACA program could not end. This was in part because the Trump administration didn't, try to end the program in a lawful way. And so this sort of leaves the door open for DACA to continue to be challenged legally, but luckily we're under a different presidential administration. So the DACA program still stands, but there are still no new applications being accepted. And so that's taken a significant toll on young people who were hoping to apply for DACA. And I just want to say that an aspect of my work that I didn't talk about as much tonight, but that is really important, focuses on undocumented immigrant youth mobilization. And so, the movement, I think the undocumented immigrant youth movement has been fundamental to pushing immigrant rights in the United States. And it's a really vibrant and exciting movement. And so I encourage you, to learn more about it. And to support those on your campus that are undocumented or have DACA status. And so I think this is one of those issues where there are probably people that you share classroom space with and campus space with that are facing these, the challenges that are tied to legal status, but also probably advocating on your campus. So I just want to thank my collaborators on this project and the folks who helped me, my research assistants and our community-based partner organizations, and those who were able to offer funding for the project. And I look forward to your questions. And I'm going to stop sharing once I find so thank you. Should have brought myself a glass of water. I'm a bad panel supporter.
Thank you. Do we have any questions for Dr. Burciaga? If you don't feel comfortable speaking up, you could throw it in the chat or send it directly to Brian Taylor. Any questions?
I'll share that I was a bit nervous to talk about like well-being and mental health amongst a group of psychologists, because I am not a psychologist. And I was like, oh no, I don't have the there's no definition. I just know that people were not doing well mentally. So So yeah, I mean, I think in the survey we did use a scale that's used in psychology to gauge people's well-being, but I have to admit I felt a bit nervous to present that aspect. Okay, so how have I seen mobilization efforts impacting identity development or sense of control? So I don't know about sense of control because that sounds like, but I do think like, so in my research, I have looked at the role of mobilization and the importance of mobilization for undocumented young people, I think feeling like a stronger sense of self-efficacy and, you know, in my book that I'm writing right now, I'm exploring this concept of future orientation, right? So how do young people envision their futures unfolding? And I can say that those that have engaged in mobilization are able to plot out a future that is more optimistic, right? That is, they can see ways that they can move forward. Whereas the young people that I've interviewed that have not engaged in mobilization, they just have a harder time navigating their futures or being optimistic about their futures or feeling like they have some sense of control over their futures. And so I think that's why participation in mobilization and community organizing, whether at the community or campus level, is really important to help people develop that sense of control over their future, that they're doing something. And I think too, the other thing that I'll add is that I think undocumented young folks struggle with sort of wanting to, they can see, they're aware that the immigration policies in the United States are not humane, particularly to undocumented immigrants, and yet also wanting to stay in the country, this country that they've grown up. So it's a tension that I think is not unique just to undocumented immigrants, but to young people of color in general, which is wanting this country to do and be so much better. So challenging, and also, saying, I believe in this country, I want to stay here, I want to be here, I am an American. So I think those are some of the tensions that I've seen emerge.
Are there any more questions? Ooh.
Okay, yeah. So yes, so I think you're right. I think that there is a lot of I'm going to say in the practical, like in the reality and in the research. And I'm of the opinion that research should sort of reflect our realities, right? So, get our research questions from the experience. So I think there's two important issues wrapped up in your comment, your observation, which is very thoughtful, which is that health, and particularly sexual health resources, are, I think, challenging for undocumented immigrants to access in the first place. And so there's a lot of, I think, room for growth for understanding, like, what are the kind of reproductive sexual health resources that DACA recipients and undocumented young people do and don't have access to. I know in California, there are some important moves to expand healthcare for all. And then a DACA status and an undocumented status is one of these statuses that I think makes individuals particularly vulnerable to violence, and violence in its many forms, unfortunately, because I think people exploit the vulnerability of the status, right? Who do you report these kinds of incidents to but law enforcement? This is why it's really super important that law enforcement come out as like a legal status neutral entity, right? Because we want people to feel like they can report. There is a specific visa that's called the U visa And the way that, unfortunately, the main way that an undocumented immigrant can become eligible for a U visa and eventually apply for residency and citizenship is if they are a victim of violence. And so the U visa is reserved for folks who have been victims of violence, and this can be within the context of personal relationships, or they are robbed or assaulted on the street. It's really terrible, but at the same time, this is one avenue through which undocumented immigrants are able to adjust their status. There's also the Violence Against Women Act, which is another sort of, I would call it violence-based process where women who are in abusive relationships that are undocumented immigrants are able to, through a lengthy legal process, if they can establish that they were victims of domestic violence or abuse, are able to adjust their status. So I think there's some ways in which our immigration laws and policies recognize the vulnerability of folks like undocumented immigrants who can be exploited, who can be abused and threatened with reporting to law enforcement by those enacting harm or violence or abuse. And at the same time, it needs to be backed up, I think, in practice in terms of making sure that the law enforcement is creating a sense of, and I know this sounds a bit odd to even say, but that law enforcement is clear that people should feel comfortable reporting crimes, violence, and abuse. Yeah, I don't, that's a really great question. You should become a researcher because I mean, I think that's like a whole like master's thesis at the least, if not a full-on dissertation, which is, yeah, I mean, how do Title IX policy offices address the experiences of undocumented students? And I think it's such a wonderful question to be asking, because I think there's both a sort of intellectual question and then there's a practical question, right? What could campuses be doing to make sure that Title IX officers and their offices are conveying the same, sense of allyship, safe space for all students, regardless of immigration status. And I think that's just a sort of campus-wide issue, right? That I know on our campus, we're kind of revamping some of our undocumented student support. And starting to offer, safe space trainings, like in, if someone goes through the training, they can put a sticker up on their wall that's like, I'm an ally to undocumented students, as a way to signal, like, if you feel comfortable sharing your status with me, you can trust me. So yeah, I think that it's, again, one thing that I have really appreciated as a scholar of this research, but also someone on a college campus, is that I think there's lots of opportunities on our campuses to make important social change on campus around this issue, in particular, by just sort of signaling allyship, and by signaling openness and support. And so I think it's been really interesting to be able to integrate my research with my role on campus and my identity as a Latina, to try to make some changes on my own campus to have more robust supports for undocumented students.
Wow. Okay. Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Burciaga. Are there any more final comments, questions? We are coming up at 5 p.m., so want to be courteous. If there aren't any more questions or comments, I will be ending the meeting. Thank you, Edelina Burciaga, for coming and talking to us about your research and your interest. This is awesome.
Yes, no, thank you. And I put my email, I sent this on Monday to the other group, but I'll reiterate it here as well, that if you are interested in talking more about my research, graduate school, I did practice as a lawyer, so law school, please do email me, and I'm happy to meet with students and just let me know that we met in this space, and I'm happy to follow up, because I know the process of applying to graduate school or even law school for many of us will be our first experience. And so I'm happy to, continue the conversation and support. And so you have a friend and ally in Colorado. If any of you are considering master's degrees in sociology, we have a program that you're welcome to apply to. So thank you.
Awesome.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Yes, thank you.
Thank you.